Robert Brodsky is on the line. Hello, Robert.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Oh, good. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Very good. Oh, thanks for calling in. We always appreciate that. So your story now, we have Chuck Schumer and Peter King getting together for a Senate vote on a background check bill. So enlighten us.
So earlier this week on Tuesday, the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Congressman Pete King, obviously representing vastly different political spectrums, held a press conference at the Walmart in Westbury to push Senate Leader Mitch McConnell to allow for a vote on a universal background check bill. This is after last week's mass shootings in Texas and Ohio. The House of Representatives, now controlled by Democrats, passed this background bill, which Congressman King was a co-sponsor of back in February, but the Senate has yet to call it for a vote. As you know, the Senate's controlled by Republicans, and Mitch McConnell pretty much has near authority to decide which bills to come to the floor. He hasn't yet allowed the bill to come to a floor for a vote.
Right. Yeah, he's got quite a few that are piling up on his desk, as I understand it. As far as just laws, not necessarily related to this, but in general.
Correct, and that's not altogether surprising or different than when there is a split levels of government is often the case. But there does seem to be some renewed momentum today. The president told the reporters, outlined his support for tougher background checks. Today, it's not clear if it would be Congressman King's bill or some other one, but there does seem to be momentum growing.
Yeah. Well, it's really good to see people from both sides of the fence getting together actually do something. If nothing else, that can generate a little optimism. Peter King and Chuck Schumer together, working to get something. Right,
and Schumer and King have found common ground on a number of issues related to local governments, whether it's airplane noise or taxes. And this seems to be what they're both calling some kind of common sense measures that would increase that would prevent a number of loopholes. There are obviously background checks that are conducted by licensed gun dealers if you want to buy a firearm in this country, but both lawmakers say that there are loopholes in existing laws, whether it's purchasing a firearm online, right, or at a gun show, right, that would allow individuals with both criminal records, potentially a history of domestic violence, or those who have been adjudicated by the courts as mentally unfit from still obtaining a firearm.
Right. Now, does this address those issues?
Right. That's what this address. This would essentially require anybody who's selling a firearm, with some basic exceptions, if you're operating a gun range, right, or involves some kind of training course. But essentially, if you are selling a firearm of any kind, you need to be a licensed dealer and conduct a background check. Okay. It's a pretty clear-cut bill. Doesn't seem to allow for a great amount of loopholes. It has obviously not gotten a great deal of support from the National Rifle Association, right, which has not been supportive of background check bills in the past, and to this moment still have not been.
Right. I was listening to the radio on the way in, and one of the things they talked about was Donald Trump had spoken about the, he was talking about this bill, I guess, and, said something about that we would have to listen to the NRA and consider their side of the story, too, which I don't know. It's like you said, they're not big fans of background checks, but I guess we'll have to see how they chime in and what they say and how that'll affect this bill.
The bill itself, or bills similar to it, have had wide support both from the vast majority of the American public and even from licensed gun owners. The NRA, on the other hand, they argue that this kind of legislation is that wouldn't have prevented any of these mass shootings in El Paso or Dayton, that the individuals who were responsible for these incidents purchased their items legally, and that they're not addressing the root cause of the violent crime and instead, quote, trying to score political points by pushing legislation that only restricts the rights of law-abiding gun owners, end quote.
Right.
So it's sort of a circular argument that we've been having in this country on guns for 20 to 30 years, where the conversations, the locations seem to change and the body count seems to change, but the talking points pretty much remain the same.
Yeah, I know. A very good observation. When we had an assault gun ban from 1994 to 2004.
Right, that was Carolyn McCarthy when she was in Congress, another Long Islander who was largely responsible for shepherding that after her election to Congress after the mass shooting on the Long Island Railroad.
Right, the Colin Ferguson. I mean, it's hard to say. How did that just lapse and we just let it go?
Yeah, it lapsed, and Republicans had controlled the Congress at the time, and there was not enough political support. And to be totally honest, I don't think there's not political support, at least in the Senate as of now, for that kind of legislation. The president said so himself, that they're not going to be restricting firearms or banning any particular types of weapons. Obviously, the next election in 2020 could change the trajectory of this argument if the Democrats elected to the White House and Democrats win back control of the Senate. But as of now, it does not appear that an assault weapons ban is anything that's being considered at this moment.
Robert, I have a question. It's Zach Turkel. When the assault weapon ban happened, were there any statistics that have changed? Was there a shortage? Like, did anything change, or did it remain the same with these?
Supporters, if I recall, have pointed to statistics that show that that shootings, particularly with the serious kinds of shootings like this, did go down, and that the violence had declined. Obviously, it's a difficult argument to make because you can ban proactively the sale of assault weapons, the semi-automatic and AK-47s, but it does nothing to prevent the weapons that are already in the hands of individuals. So it would take I would imagine it would take a long amount of time to determine the kind of the curve of this argument, to determine the long-term statistics, because over the course of 5 or 6 years, if you're stopping the new sales, that's one thing, but it doesn't address the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of those same firearms that are already out there in millions of American homeowners.
Right. But in some sense, the same applies to this law about background checks.
Correct. I think most people would agree there's very little appetite for a government that's going to seize firearms from local homes, from people who have purchased their firearms legally. So all you can do is change the law proactively, so that you move forward. But that requires change that takes a lot longer over time to change.
Yeah. Oh, well, I wish we had a crystal ball, and I wish we could change things. But so this is a good step. I mean, this is.
It seems to be. We seem to be moving in a direction, little by little. Whether it's by shame or political pressure, or the fact that the NRA is not the political behemoth that it once was.
Good point.
Or just that the overwhelming support that this kind of legislation has. But it does seem like we are moving closer, and I think we moved closer today, with the president's words, towards a more universal background check.
Yeah. Oh, it'd be a great thing. Really would. You have another story, the one about the Nassau proposing to ensure county preparedness in active shooter situations. Right.
Clearly, gun violence was the topic of the week.
Yeah, really, right?
On both Long Island and across the country. Nassau legislator Josh Lavizan, who's a independent who caucuses with Democrats, and he introduced a series of proposals on Monday. He wants the legislature to create a permanent task force dealing with crisis response, dealing with the issue of gun violence. So he would invite elected officials, crisis managers, law enforcement officials from cities that have had mass shootings to speak to members of the county legislature to offer points of wisdom about what has worked there and what hasn't, so that the county would be better prepared.
Right.
He also wants to have a roundtable meeting with the leaders of many local hospitals to ensure that they're better prepared for mass casualty events, so that they would be able to secure blood donations and improve their emergency communications in the instance of the mass shooting. And he wants law enforcement officials to start reaching out to millennials, Lafazan being one himself, to kind of offer guidance on how to better monitor social media if individuals start professing plans to incite hate or to conduct attacks, that millennials would be able to sort of better identify these warning signs. Obviously, the individual who's been charged in El Paso, the gunman, he had an online manifesto in which he supposedly targeted where it was an anti-immigrant manifesto in which he professed his plans to attack Hispanics. So they're kind of jumping off this idea that we need to better monitor social media.
Yeah, well, some of these people do telescope their intentions. So, I mean, there have been quite a few cases where people's, I think just one of the recent ones, one of the shooters, his mother, supposedly contacted police and said, my son's got an AK-47. Is he old enough to shoot this thing? And does he, and apparently they just let it go. I don't know that they could. How do you answer every one of those? I'm sure there's quite,
and quite often these individuals, they post their manifesto only, online only a few minutes before they commit their acts. So there's limits to what can and will be done.
Yeah. Well, I think these are big questions, but it's nice to see some activity in the right direction anyway, and we'll keep our fingers crossed as to the outcome of the bill and what it can do.
Right, and there's certainly no harm in being better prepared.
No, definitely not. Well, thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you guys for having us.
Well, thanks for the work you do and for giving us a call and letting us talk to you about it.
Great, have a good weekend.
You too, take care. And of course, we always want to thank Newsday and Robert. It's Robert Brodsky for his reporting and the work they do, trying to get all the facts down, and so we have things to talk about.